There we go. All right, welcome everybody. So today we're going to be talking a bit about program evaluation for programs, really just some basics that you can take with you to launch any type of evaluation procedures that you have to really get things moving. So before we get started, just a bit about me. For most of you, I think I recognize most of the names. You either know me or been on our webinars before, but my name's Jack Kavanaugh. I'm our Director of Training and Program Development. I've spent the past 15 years working with young people in mentoring programs, youth development programs, schools, summer camps, all types of different settings. I've been with Mentor New York for a little over, or almost 3 years now. And I'm based out of our Western New York office up in Buffalo. We do serve programs across New York State. The bulk of our team is based in New York City, but we do work with programs really from all over. So before we get started, I would like to start with a couple of quick polls. So let me share a few questions and you can let me know where we're at. So first, let's start with, how are you feeling? How's everyone's Wednesday afternoon? All right. So it looks like a solid, folks doing pretty well today, which is always nice to see. I know when I get a bunch of, the dear guy get me out of this house answers and things like that, it tends to be a little bit dicier. So I'm glad people are doing well. Let's do a second one. So I want to know if your program or your organization has any of these kind of formalized and written in place. Do you have a mission statement, a documented, written down theory of change, or a logic model? You can select more than one, so whichever ones you have in place. All right. So it looks like everyone has, a mission statement. 25% have a theory of change, 25% have a logic model. So it looks like a decent amount of you don't, but a solid few do, which is awesome. All right, one last one. When you talk about things like a theory of change or a logic model, how knowledgeable would you say that you are? All right. So that's fun. We got 100% on one answer. Doesn't happen often. But so most of you, you're all, kind of familiar, you've heard of them. We're not entirely sure exactly what it means or, how to build one out. So that's perfect. That's what we're here to talk about today. So start with when we're thinking about any type of, program evaluation strategy or thinking about how we start to build up either a theory of change or a logic model. Ultimately, the question that we're trying to answer is, what does your program do? Like, what do you do? And I think it's going to be easy for a lot of mentoring programs or, other organizations to have a hard time really answering this because they're sort of like, what do you mean? Like, we provide mentoring, that's what we do. But in order to really think about how we start to evaluate if we're doing what we think that we're doing, we have to first be able to articulate what it is that we do. And so we're going to talk a bit more about how we start to answer this question, right? But ultimately, I want you to keep this in your mind, as this is the question that is going to drive any type of evaluation strategies that you want to do, any type of development of your mission statement, your logic model, your theory of change. They're all just different ways of answering this question, which is what does your program do? And so it all starts with a mission statement. Before we dig in a little bit more, I do also want to make sure I let everyone know you can, totally ask questions as we go. I'll also leave time at the end for questions before we depart. I always like to leave at least 15 minutes or so at the end for individual questions specifically around, your program or anything specifically that you might need. But you are more than welcome to put questions in the question box on the side there as we go. So mission statements, I think a lot of programs have some type of mission statement in place. One thing to consider too is sometimes you might have a different one in place for your organization and your program. So a lot of mentoring programs are part of a larger, nonprofit organization, right? They're one piece of it, or they're a larger part of some type of, social services agency or something like that. And so the organization as a whole might have some kind of mission statement in place. So it might be able to say, we provide, support services to young people and families, etc. And so I'm sure you have that. If you are part of a larger organization, I always encourage you to have some type of programmatic mission statement. It doesn't have to be, particularly long, but I think it can be useful, particularly in sort of driving a lot of your decision making and figuring out, again, how do we start to evaluate our, program's progress. Any statement should be clear and concise. It shouldn't be more than, it should definitely not be more than one sentence, and it shouldn't be a particularly long sentence. What we wanted to do is make sure it articulates who we serve and how. So what are we doing? So for Mentor New York, where I work, obviously, our mission statement is that Mentor New York's mission is to fuel the quantity and quality of mentoring relationships across New York State to close the mentoring gap. So we do two things. We close the quantity, we fuel the quality. So where mentoring relationships exist, we work to strengthen them. And quantity, so where relationships aren't happening, we work to fuel new ones across New York State. So it's our organization, what the problem that we're trying to address is, right? The mentoring gap, and just a sense of how we do that through fueling quantity and quality of relationships. Simple, straightforward, to the point. I think one of the things I've seen a lot too is organizations will get really caught up on this why or this visioning as part of their mission. Like, our organization's mission is to, cure world hunger, right? And you don't want it to be that sort of lofty. You want to save that sort of why for your vision statement, right? Like, your vision is a world without, child poverty or something like that. And those are awesome. And you want to make sure that those are very clear to your stakeholders, but it's a little bit different than specifically thinking about, your mission. And so I think the mission statement is important for three specific reasons. One is, if you're applying for funding, you're applying for grants, things like that, that's going to be the first question they ask every time. What's your program name, tax ID number, mission statement. And so if you have an organizational one, if you're a smaller program, you're going to put that on things like that. But it's the first sort of cue for external partners in order to say, this is who we are, this is what our program does. And so the second one is just an extension of that, right? So, for not just in terms of applying for funding, but any sort of community stakeholder, if we're able to communicate more effectively with external folks around what it is that we do as an organization, then that means our program has that focus, has that drive, and can be, very effective. So it's an opportunity for, organizations and programs to share with those external partners around, what it is that we do, what our program is built to do, etc. And the last thing here at the bottom is about using it as that sort of rallying cry. I think this is really powerful too. As you're bringing in, new folks, or you have new employees or volunteers, or making decisions yourself, being able to have that sort of centering touchstone that that like, all right, where we are is to fuel the quality, quantity of mentoring relationships. If that's our goal, if that's our mission, then we can use that as the foundation for developing all the rest of our programs. So if we know our mission is to, provide young women with access to social capital to, grow success in college and career, and we know that's our mission, then we need to make sure all of our programs, all of our pieces are in line to support that specific mission. So once you have that in place, I don't want to spend too much time on it because it seems like a lot of folks have that in place. The next sort of level is about the theory of change. So your theory of change is, honestly, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's your theory for how you think you're getting whatever your target population is from point A to point B. So if your theory of change is, again, just your theory, your thought, what you assume is going to happen if you take your young people, provide them with some type of intervention, what that intervention that you provide is, in order to achieve an optimal outcome. So let's watch a quick video that explains this a little bit. All right. So I always think those videos are pretty useful for folks to kind of get a sense. And I always appreciate, at least for me, when I'm trying to learn something new, using some type of analogy like assembling a wardrobe can be useful. But here's another organization's example of what a theory of change might be. So this is an organization called Align. So this is the Alliance for Greater New York. And so you can kind of see how they start to break theirs down. So on the left, you see here their current conditions, right? This is the world that we live in now that we believe is flawed or broken in some way. And then over on the right, you see the vision, right? This is ultimately our goal, where we want to see the identified problem that we have, where we want to see it move, how we want to see it take shape over a long period. And so for Align, their current conditions is around what they term an extraction economy, right? Where resources of workers, the environment, and communities of color are taken by a small corporate elite to the long-term detriment of all. Certainly sounds pretty rough. And their idea of a holistic vision where they want to see the community end up is what they term a living economy, where economic prosperity, environmental sustainability, and social justice are balanced to the long-term benefit of all life. Sounds pretty awesome. And so the theory of change is all about, again, how they get from the current conditions to the vision. And so for them, they start with these different strategies: building powerful, long-standing alliances, winning precedent-setting policies, shaping the public debate, and engaging individuals to take action. Once they have those in place, they can move to the next step, which is about growing coalition campaigns, capacity initiatives, community and labor visioning. Then they move into their impact. So if they're doing all of these, and they're going to be creating good jobs, reducing pollution, advancing social justice, expanding democracy, which will then take them into their vision. And so as they're starting to design, programs, make decisions, seek funding, things like that, they can see where do these initiatives fit in to our theory of change, right? Does this align, no pun intended, with our goals, with our mission, with where we want to see our work move? And so they have this clearly outlined. In the little handout section, there should be on the side panel, should be a handout with the theory of change worksheet. So I'm going to just show you this really quick. You can find similar things like this online too. This isn't the only one. It was just one that I chose. But this is what it should look like. And so this is an exercise that you can do to have a conversation, as an organizational level around your theory of change. And so it starts with identifying the long-term social change that our organization is trying to achieve. For a lot of mentoring organizations, it's just around social disconnection. It could be about improving college and career readiness. It could be about improving social emotional skills that young people are lacking, that there's a gap in. And so you're able to answer some of these questions, right? What's the root cause? Who is our constituency? What are our main strategies? What sort of assumptions and evidence do we have in place? And how will we know that we have success? What are preconditions for success? And then again, what does that long-term look like? And so this is going to be different for every program, but it's important to be able to articulate, what it is that your program does in a way that articulates clearly where we are, where we'd like to go, and what are the steps that we believe will get us there. So for mentoring programs specifically, there's a few theories of change. But here's an example of one that I've seen a program use that I think was a successful kind of iteration of what they were trying to accomplish. So for them, they take young people, and through increased social capital and advocacy for inclusive spaces, that will result in a diverse and successful workforce. So the current space that they're in right now is a world that does not have a diverse and successful workforce, right? Companies are having a hard time recruiting and retaining employees of color for any number of reasons. Young people are not as successful when they're transitioning into the workforce. And so the gap is between young people seeking employment and their ability to be successful in college and career. And so their end goal, they're up here, is around, creating a place where there's workplaces that are supportive and capable of engaging a diverse and multicultural, multifaceted workforce, whether that's racially, gender, supporting LGBTQ employees, any facet of a diverse workforce, as well as making sure that there are candidates and folks entering their talent pipelines who are equipped to be successful. And so the steps that they see between that are two things. The first is increase social capital for young people. So making sure that they have access to mentors, other supports, resources that allow them to increase their social capital to be more successful, right? To be those sort of well-equipped people entering the talent pipeline. And then also this advocacy for inclusive spaces. So working with employers, with institutions of higher education, things like that, on better strategies to better equip and engage these young people, to have them, it's one thing to get them in the door, it's another thing to have them be successful over time. And so one of the things that we've also seen is some theories of change from organizations that are, I think, less good. So here's some examples of what they might not be. The first one is just that you take a youth and you bring them into contact with an adult, and good things are just going to happen, right? Our theory of change is just that if we take kids, we take adults, we put them together in a relationship, successful outcomes will just, it's a good thing, it'll just happen. That's not really a theory of change, right? That's just, an articulation of what you're doing. That's a program. It doesn't say anything about what is that program trying to accomplish. It doesn't say anything about how does this impact our mission and how does it feed in with other sorts of interventions that we're providing. Another piece of this that I've seen from some programs too that, we've talked to a lot of programs out over the past few years, is particularly for programs that are mentoring predominantly young people of color in combination with predominantly white mentors, is that it's really positive in this idea that if we just take young people of color and bring them in closer proximity to whiteness, so white people, white institutions, things like that, then again, we're just going to have magically successful outcomes. So all that young people of color need is, connections to these sort of worlds and spaces that white middle upper class mentors can provide them, or they need to go to these schools or get entry to these workplaces. And this is problematic for a few reasons. One, again, it's also just a poorly written theory of change. It doesn't actually identify what the problem is. If anything, what it says to the problem is that young people of color just don't have access to whiteness, and so the solution is to bring them some, which is, one, just an issue that's rooted in a deficit-based mindset, which we want to avoid with young people, and particularly one that is deficit-based around, communities of color not having access to resources and not honoring the resources and social capital that young people are bringing with them. And so we want to make sure we're really taking that time to think about, again, how are we taking, what is the problem that we are identifying? Why does our program or organization exist? What is it that we're trying to solve? And how does our program have built-in steps to get us there? So I'm going to show you one more thing. So one of the resources that is available on the internet that I like to share with programs, and some of you may have seen this, this is the National Mentoring Resource Center website. So it's just nationalmentoringresourcecenter.org. I'm going to put it into the tag here so you have it. There's a lot of really, really valuable resources here. And I'm going to share a couple of them with you while we're talking. But the first one is this, which is if you go to Learning Hub and down here, it's logic models and theories of change. And so what this is, and this is a newer page on here, so if you've been here in the past, this may not have happened, and they're also adding new ones. I was just here like 2 weeks ago and these ones weren't on. So they're coming in pretty regularly. And so it's examples of a logic model and a theory of change for different types of mentoring programs. So let's look at this community-based one-on-one mentoring. Open it up. All right, so this is their theory of change. So it doesn't have to be this complicated. You know, the one that Align has isn't quite as complicated as this. But ultimately, what they're looking at is taking these young people, you know, who are lacking access to social capital and resources, providing them with mentoring relationships. And through those mentoring relationships, they're doing two things. One, providing them with protective factor enhancement. So taking things like self-advocacy, coping skills, goal setting, motivation, providing them with enriching activities to help build protective factors, and then helping them avoid risk factors. So, you know, could be school misconduct or attendance, could be negative social experiences or parent stress, because we're helping alleviate some of these things. So simultaneously enhancing protective factors and reducing risk factors. And through these, you know, the outcomes that we're hoping to see are positive functioning, so academic, social, emotional well-being, pro-social behavior, so community service, community engagement, things like that, healthy lifestyle behavior, all that sort of thing, as well as reduced adaptive difficulties. So again, both improved skills as well as reduced weaknesses. So we're helping them avoid academic issues, mental health challenges, you know, limiting substance use, things like that, which then ultimately leads to a healthy and successful transition to adulthood. So again, it's, you know, looking at a lot of mentoring programs that might say, well, we just take, you know, young people and provide them with mentors and good outcomes will happen. That is not, you know, a theory of change, but that doesn't mean that a mentoring program needs to have anything more complicated than just saying, you know, we have young people and we're providing them with mentoring relationships that are doing these things to result in a healthy and successful transition to adulthood. But what this does is it starts to articulate the why and the how of how we're moving from step A to step Z. We're using the mentoring relationships to do this, which is going to lead to this. And that's our theory of change. I'm going to close this for now. I'm going to come back to the same program to share with you the same program's logic model in a minute. Yeah, but let's get back to this for now. So that's a theory of change. So now we're going to talk about logic models. So let's start with another quick video about this. This one doesn't want to work. I'm going to make sure this gets emailed out to you guys so you can watch it later. I know I was having issues with this video too earlier, but that's okay. So we'll just talk through it. So this is developing a logic model. So again, if you look in the handout section, there's an example of a logic model worksheet that should basically look a lot like this and have these columns. That's typically how you'll see them laid out. You might see a number of different, people will add various levels of complexity. Oh, let me make sure apologies. There we go. All right. So in the handouts, you'll see that. So it looks like these with these columns, and there's various level of complexities. The one I'll share with you in a minute might be a little bit more, you know, complex. This is a fairly simple breakdown, and you might see different columns or things like that. But the basic things that you'll always see fall into three different categories. The first is inputs. So these are what resources you have to follow your program. So money, time, facilities, staff's expertise, staff that are, you know, particularly well trained, volunteers, partnerships and infrastructure that you have in place to own your building, you have a really strong vetted, program history. So your program is really strong because it's been running for 50 years. You have, community buy-in, all sorts of things like that. What are those inputs? So again, using the analogy of the wardrobe, the inputs is like the list of the pieces. These are all of the pieces that you're going to put together. So it's all of the different, these two doors, you come with 20 screws, like that kind of thing. The packing list, so to speak, I guess, is your inputs. Then your activities are activities that use resources to create and deliver those outputs. So all the things that you do with them. So thinking about, the different activities might be things like, mentoring relationships, providing support to mentors. It could be providing academic tutoring. It could be providing, training experiences or field trips or anything, whatever it is that you're doing in terms of activities. The outputs is the direct product of those. So you'll typically see these always have like numbers with them. So with the activities, it's going to say we did, like last year we did 20 field trips. We did 10 training sessions. We provided mentoring to this many, young people and supported this many mentors and, all of these types of things. So typically you'll have some type of number attached to them. And again, I'll share with you an example in a minute. And so then you're thinking about your outcomes. You can have short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes. You'll see these running on different levels of scale depending on your program, but this is a really nice way to break it down. That your short-term outcomes will affect knowledge, skills, abilities, attitudes, awareness. So building some of those, social skills, enhanced, maybe coping strategies, academic support, things like that. Medium-term outcomes are things that might not happen right away, but take a little bit of time. So behaviors and practices. It could be things like, if you do social action or if you do advocacy work, policies, changing motivations. So this could take, a year or 2 years of consistent, engagement with your program to really accomplish. A lot of mentoring programs, I think outcomes tend to fall in this range. And then your long-term outcomes is really your societal impact. So environmental, social, economic, civic, things like that. So again, thinking about changes in learning. So really, really immediate things, changes in action, and then changes in conditions. And so at the bottom here, you can see the two sort of categories it falls under, right? Your planned work. So what are the things that you plan to do with it? What are your inputs and what are you planning to do with it? And then what are your intended results? This is what outputs we plan to do. And these are the outcomes that we think are going to get there. So it's taking your theory of change and just breaking it down a little bit more to say, okay, this is what we think is going to happen. These are steps that we have to take. How does that fit together with the inputs and activities that we have? And how do those tie into, the outcomes that we anticipate seeing? I think one way to think about this is, using the wardrobe example, if your logic model is the sort of assembly instructions, your logic model is taking that and adding in, your sort of like instructions on how to use it. So it's not just assembly, it's the whole program manual. So it's the theory of change tells you where the pieces are and how to assemble them, where the logic model is really telling you that how you're going to use it once it's built. So let me share with you then the logic model of the same program that I was sharing the theory of change of before. So this is an example. This is a very, I'll say not, I don't think they had the graphic designer review these. But this is an example of one might look like. So you have your needs. So this is, understanding kind of, again, and not every program will have this in their logic model, but think that theory of change, right? That what is the sort of gaps that you're identifying? So large numbers of youth lack consistency and intensity of care and adult support. As many in 1 in youth of 3 youth appear to lack any adult mentor outside their family. Youth at risk due to factors such as poverty, etc. Then you have your inputs. So, financial, grants, donations, in-kind support, leadership, program staff, your mentors, partnerships, all different kind of, assets that you bring to the table. And then activities, so training and supporting mentors and staff, recruiting and engaging with young people, mentor orientation, the matching process, match closure, guidance, different activities, all sorts of things like that, which then leads to outputs. So you'll see these are mostly numbers if you can see it. So numbers of mentors recruited and accepted, percent of youth recruitment and screening activities completed, percent of mentoring relationships sustained over the minimum expected length. So if your program's like a year or a school year or however long. And then at the end, at the right side, then you start to see those outcomes. So you have personal factor, protective factor development. So, engaging with skills. Then you have your risk factor avoidance. So those are, emotional concerns, reduced misconduct, negative social experiences. Intermediate, stronger positive functioning around academic support. So attendance, grades, healthy lifestyle behavior, and then reducing things like academic issues, mental health challenges, substance abuse. And then long-term outcomes. So, employment, avoidance of justice system involvement, physical health. One thing you'll see here at the bottom is they have these little boxes for key assumptions and external factors. Again, not every program includes things like this, but if you have particular things that you want to add, that you want to make sure that you're putting in here, then you can do that. But again, everyone's a little bit different. All right. So if you take a look at that logic model worksheet that's in the handouts, it's a really valuable tool to start building some of these out, right? What are your inputs? What's some of your activities? And this is something that we can help support you on. If you want some, talk through some of this stuff, definitely reach out after this. We can help walk you through some of these things for sure. This definitely could be a tricky process as if it's not something you've really spent time doing before. So you have your logic model, you have your theory of change. Ultimately, what we want to be able to do is to take this and tell the story and the narrative of our program, right? That's what we're doing. We're answering that question, what does our program do? And so saying we mentor young people or we provide mentors to young people, if that's not enough, that's not really saying what you're doing. What your program might do is we provide mentors to young people to really help them build social skills, help them, navigate, hard situations that they have to deal with, to hopefully get them, more prepared to be successful in college and career, right? That is a theory of change. That is what your program does. And so thinking about, if your program is focused on specific things, I was talking a lot about kind of career readiness because those are a lot of programs I've been working with lately. But that's obviously not the only sort of successful outcome for young people. It could be about building the next generation of community organizers and civic engagement, or about, enhancing young people, building up their own sense of being mentors and mentoring other young people with a peer mentoring program, things like that. And so when you think about the theory of change and the logic model, this informs data collection and what outcomes you think can be tracked based on those and what your expected outcomes are. So by outlining, these are the things that we think are going to happen, that if we take young people, we provide this intervention, we think this thing is going to occur at the end, then that's how we start to delve back and say, all right, well, what do we need to start measuring to know if this is happening or not? So what do we need to survey our young people? What sort of data do we need to collect to know if what we think is happening from point A to point Z is actually happening? And so when we think about different data collection tools, you want to identify, ask yourself a few questions, right? What's your capacity? If you have one staff member who's only like part-time running, a large program and is, barely able to kind of keep holding on, then you're not necessarily going to be layering in some, massive program evaluation strategy that's going to eat up a lot of their bandwidth. It just doesn't make sense. However, if you're a larger organization that has the capacity of collecting some, really, in-depth data, then, all the better. Think about who are your stakeholders, right? If you have close connections with a school, if you're a school-based program, then you might have access to, more direct academic data, right, that you can get from them directly if you get the parents and families to sign off on it. If you are partnering with I don't know, any other sort of community stakeholders that you might be able to, bring into this process. Additionally, it might be helpful to think about how are we thinking about our impact on mentors and families and not just on the mentees. So what impact are we having on them? And do we want to survey the mentors and parents or guardians or anything like that? Or do we want to talk to, again, if you have a close relationship with a school or an after-school program, or we're working with a program that focuses on young people with mental health issues, and so they work really closely with counselors and therapists that those young people are seeing, so they have, are able to build some data in from that. So who are these other stakeholders that we can kind of loop into this process that might provide us with insight into answering the question of, what does our program do? And of course, if there are funders that are funding you that want to see specific outcomes, you want to make sure that you are getting them what they need, because you don't want the money to fall through. However, you don't want to only be getting what it is that funders are asking for, because then you're really limiting your ability to, again, tell your story and seek other types of funding, right? And so starting to look ahead as much as possible, thinking about, how can we make sure that we're getting this data? What types of resources are we providing? Things like that. And so again, measurements to tell a story. I can't stress this enough. All of this is about telling a narrative, a story of what your program does and what it provides young people. And so in order to do that, you want to build in both qualitative, which is, like open-ended questions or interviews or testimonials or things like that. That kind of data, which can be really powerful and tell really powerful stories, with the quantitative, which is really, that's the data, numbers, anything that can be really quantified. And so you want to do both, because qualitative data without numbers is just stories. Like there's no real data to back that up. But quantitative data without the qualitative piece is just numbers. There's no humanity to it. There's no story to it. And so you want to have a little bit of both, so you're able to really tell the story of what we do. So if you're able to collect, let's say your program is really focused, school-based program is really focused on improving and increasing attendance and academic outcomes. Your quantitative is going to be, increase in GPA over, X months, an increase in attendance over this time, and then getting a few kind of, qualitative pieces where it's mentors or mentees and teachers or, whoever talking about the impact that they've seen over the program, or the mentees talking about, this is why this has been helpful for me. Because those packaged together are going to tell a really great story about what your program does. And so you ask yourself two questions. One is, what do we do and how do we know it? So again, what do we do? And then how do we know that that's what we're doing, right? So it's one thing to have that logic model and one thing to have that theory of change and articulate what we do. But then we have to go back and say, all right, how do we know that's actually what's happening? How do we know that what we think is that our theory of change is actually what's happening? And then we can adjust our programming if what we think is happening isn't. And then secondly, also thinking about what are we good at? What kind of things do we need to work on? And again, how do we know? What types of resources do we need to be building into our program? So ultimately, when any kind of evaluation strategy comes down to instruments. So these are the different surveys and things like that. So again, let's go back to that National Mentoring Resource Center. So if you go back up to this Learning Hub section here, and you go down to the bottom, or here to the middle, it's the Measurement Guidance Toolkit. So there's all sorts of different surveys and things that you can use here that are all rooted in some type of evidence-based support. When someone says evidence-based, all that means is someone did some research into this survey and found it to be like pretty reliable. What that means for you ultimately is just that these are programs and things that you can use to work on to measure your program, and you can say that you're using a program, a measurement to assess if this thing is happening that has been used before. So for example, and so these are different evidence-based measures that you can use. They're totally free for you. And so there's all sorts of different categories that you can tap into: mentoring relationship quality, mental and emotional health, social emotional skills, healthy pro-social behavior, problem behavior, interpersonal relationships, academics, risk and protective factors. They're always adding new ones, so make sure you're checking this. But so say, for example, you wanted to look at risk and protective factors, and you want to look at risk factors for youth opioid misuse. Here's a survey for that. Let's say you want to look at a healthy and pro-social behavior, and you want to look at civic engagement. Here's a scale that you can use for that. Now, when you look at each one of these, it'll say, intended age range, specifically what it measures. So, they might not be your specific age range, but you might look at the survey and see that it still works. Some of them definitely might not. And so a brief description, any sort of cautions, how to use it. Then what you'll find here is access and permissions. So for this one specifically, this measure is available for non-commercial use with no charge or permission required, and a link to it is available here. And so it'll download it as part of a Word document file. Some of them might say, email this person and ask for permission. I'm trying to see if I can find one that says that. No. But they're all free. Just sometimes the researchers just want to know who's using it. They might ask you for de-identified data if they're doing any kind of meta studies, things like that. But they're all free to use. And this is a really great place to start once you identify those resources in place or those goals, to say, okay, how do we start measuring that? This is in no way comprehensive, and some programs work to develop their own, but I think it can be a really helpful place to start. So that's the free resources, that measurement guidance toolkit here. Typically, these can be used as a pre and post test. So if you run a year-long program, I would do it at the beginning of the year, at the end, so you can see where they score before and after your programming, so you can start to see some of that growth. If your program is, a school year before and after, et cetera, if you run a program that's like multi-years, like they're working in relationship with each other for 3, 4, 5 years, however long, then you want to hit various touch points throughout that, maybe do an annual survey, things like that. There are also in-depth, really comprehensive assessments that you can use to measure all sorts of things around social emotional health or anything like that if you have the capacity. Typically, these are not free. You have to pay for access to these, but they can be pretty good if you have the capacity, financial and staffing-wise, to administer them. So DESA, SEAM, ages and stages, these are just examples of large in-depth assessments. And on top of that, it's always good to have some type of program satisfaction survey. So elevating youth and marginalized voices, right? If we want to make sure we're asking young people who might not be asked typically about their experiences with the program to provide that active feedback. We want to make sure the program feels like it's something that the young people and the mentees are active participants in and not sort of passive recipients of, right? The mentoring relationship is a two-sided street that people are coming together and building a relationship. And so the mentees are an active part of that process. And so their input is incredibly valuable. Anything that we can do to make the relationship feel less like these are young people that are receiving any kind of like passive, that they're just passive recipients of mentoring, we want to avoid that. And it's always good to have some type of continuous quality improvement. There's always room to improve. There's always room to make sure that we're doing our processes a little bit better. So what are we doing? And so again, thinking about what really are outcomes and what are we actually good at. Some programs, if they haven't had this type of strategy in place before, they might have this sense of what we're good at, what we're doing, what our outcomes are. And then they start measuring things and realize that's not at all what their actual what the positive impact they're having is. They're still having some great impact. Like we know that we are. It's just in a different area than we thought it was. And we didn't realize that until we started doing some of these measurements. And ultimately, we want to make sure we know why mentors and mentees stay and why they leave. If we're having any type of retention issues and mentor-mentee attrition, we want to know why. And so providing some type of exit surveys, data like that, is really going to help you make sure your program is running as efficiently as possible. All right, so that's all I got for you today. Finished a little early, which is nice. I'll give you the part of your afternoon back. I'm going to pause here for any questions. I'm going to go to the survey. The contact page. So here's my email address. You can definitely feel free to reach out. I'm going to put it into the chat here as well. It still says Bruce's email. He actually retired a few months ago, so I got to take that off. But that's my email. You can always reach out at any point. We're always happy to be of assistance to any programs. We provide lots of different services, and we're always happy to provide some supports. If you have questions that you want to follow up on, definitely shoot me an email. We're always available. We're more than happy to provide any resources, support that we can. I'm going to stick around for another couple of minutes in case anyone has any questions. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and your week, and I appreciate you taking the time out to join us today.